Hello and welcome to RIVE, Reflections in Veterinary Education. We are back with a journal club this month, and it was my turn to pick an article. And so I have selected pre and post course self assessments to promote recognition of learning in veterinary students. And this was by Margaret Kustritz. I don't know if I'm saying her last name right. I apologize, Margaret. But this was in JVME this year. And I selected this one a little bit selfishly because there's some fun things that they talk just a little bit about that I would love to dig a little bit deeper into. But yeah, so lovely to start with. I don't know. Either I can give an overview, or if I want to hear your all's over your first impressions. But yeah.
Yeah, why don't you do a brief summary?
So essentially it's a teaching tip. So it's a short article. It's a nice little read. And what they did was they gave students in, oh gosh, it was like three different courses now. I'm forgetting,
Yep.
in the curriculum that, they gave them sort of pre and post, sort of self-assessments. What they were doing was basically asking the students to think about, like, what did you learn in this course at the beginning, essentially at the end of the course, like reflect back and think about and document what you've learned, and what impact that had on sort of their recognition of their own learning, their assessment, what have I learned? And their reasoning, which again, this is in the introduction, they talk about this being like a motivating factor, right? Recognition or believing that you can learn something can be motivating. And that's really where I want to dig into it. But let me go back. Flip my pages. Sorry, I'm being kind of loud here. So they compared, it was two different groups of students in these different courses. So three different courses. And so the students were given, how much do you think you know, or rate your knowledge of this topic, and then rate your knowledge or how confident. So it wasn't quite a self-efficacy assessment, but it was like approaching that. So as an example, I would have an answer, but would not be confident was totally correct for a certain topic, right? That was like their Likert scale of different things. And then they said, how did they rate themselves before the class and then after the class? And then, so the students could document, okay, my score at the beginning of class was this, and they were saying, so this wasn't based on their exam scores or the instructor's assessment of what they've learned, but how did they feel about their ability to answer certain questions or to deal with a clinical scenario. And so, yeah, there's the students are like, yes, I have learned certain things. I'm more, their reporting was higher scores in these categories, which is what we would expect and what we would hope. But it's nice, I think, for the students to be reporting that. So it's not just like, here's a documentation of what we've learned, but how are they feeling about their own knowledge? So that was the overview. Other things that I should have pointed out.
I don't think so.
So yeah, it's a nice quick little read. And so I think couple of reasons I wanted to kind of bring this up. I don't know if this is true, but my assumption is that this is something that somebody was doing. Like, this is a thing I'm doing because I think it's a cool thing. And it's like, why am I not sharing the results with other people? Why? So it's one of those things that I think can be an example of an opportunity to share something that you may already be doing that other could give people some insight or have some other ideas. Not that I want to promote just like, oh, just tell everybody the little things you're doing in your teaching. Like, you need to be thoughtful about it. Is there something unique to this? Is there something that could benefit other people? Or can I look at this through a theoretical lens and make some explanations to that? So I don't want to be like, yeah, just publish anything you're doing. That's good research. No, but I do think that there are sometimes opportunities, especially in the JVME teaching tip, which I think is a great kind of avenue for these types of things, to say, here's the thing I'm doing and here's the benefits that I'm seeing. Is this, something that could inspire you to do something similar? So that's one of the reasons I wanted to kind of bring it up. So that's one thing we can discuss. And then the other thing I want to talk about motivation. So that's the other big thing that I think is really fun. But so I want to give you all a chance to chime in on that first bit as far as, these types of publications in veterinary education.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think they're valuable in the sense that you've talked about. I think one of the things that's also really valuable is that, at least for me, when I read these, they're nice and short, which is helpful, but I also end up with more questions about things. And I think sometimes that's frustrating, but sometimes that's really enlightening and interesting because it gives you an opportunity to think about, okay, well, if I were going to incorporate this into my class, how would I incorporate it? And what questions would I want to answer that maybe aren't answered in this question? Or is this something that maybe I could reach out to this individual author and say, hey, I'm thinking about implementing in this in my course. One of the things I'm interested in is X. Did you do any research on that? Could we talk about it? What do you think? So I think it's kind of a nice way to get at, me personally to kind of reflect on my own practice, how what they're telling me could potentially affect me, but then also take that next step of saying, what questions did they not answer that maybe I could answer if I chose to do this? So I think there's lots of value and again, it's like 3 pages. It doesn't take very long, but it's still interesting, right? So I love
and you
that.
know what? I just came up with this, but JVME, based on what you said, they could rename it Teaching Tip of the Iceberg.
Oh,
It's like the Wheel of Fortune before and after. Anyway, sorry. I had to share that really nerdy thought I had.
I love that. So I do actually have some questions that I thought about while I was reading this. But I really enjoyed sort of just the idea. And it seemed to me, there was one section in there where it seemed to me like they were doing it in a class or 2 classes, and then another class had experienced it before, was like, hey, we want to do that, which I mean, that's pretty cool, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was kind of I don't think they said that explicitly, but I think that's why I think this is the thing that they're just doing. And so it's like, let's write it up. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, the thing that it makes me think of is, when we talk about this scholarship of teaching and learning, especially as biomedical researchers, that's our background, that people think like, I've got to do a massed, controlled, prospective, experimental study design if I'm going to do any education research. And it's like, I mean, there's a place for those.
Absolutely.
But the spectrum of scholarship of teaching and learning is so broad that, like you said, Bob, you can't just like slap something together. But like, they did a literature review for this. They did some quantitative data collection. They did some qualitative data collection, and so there were methods to it that were not as detailed as a educational research report, which is JVME's, kind of more experimental oriented publications, but it's a work, and that should be reflected in your publications and your P&T and your FT and all that stuff.
Yep.
That is I just have to say that is a really adorable cat.
I know. I'm like, look how cute she is.
I know, she's freaking adorable.
This is so if you're listening to the podcast and you're not watching it on YouTube, you could go to the YouTube channel and see Eric's very adorable kitten right now. Is she actually a kitten or is she just one of those cats that looks young?
Yeah, no, we got him in May. So
sorry.
Offend him. Yeah. He definitely has a kitteny face, but
super cute.
Right,
anyway,
sorry.
We're easily distracted. Yeah. So anyway, if this is an opportunity to inspire somebody else who is maybe doing something that would take just a little bit more work, as Eric said, like, analyze some data or, maybe add a survey or, to say, here's the thing I'm doing. Let's see what I can get out of what I'm already doing, maybe add a little bit. And it's a great way to get started in these types of things too. And then, as Catherine said, all the ideas come from like, it's a never ending, like, oh, and then this could lead to that, which could lead to that. But you inspire other people with their ideas, something that was like, oh, it's right there. And then, oh man, that's actually really close to something I was thinking about. What if I took that? And so, yeah, just the sharing of ideas is so lovely. And so I really like that JVME has like the teaching tip. And I think it's great that the bar that is set is not like it, like you said, Eric, it doesn't have to be this particularly standardized, well thought out. Those are good. And we want those. Again, it doesn't have to be either or though, right? Like we can have all of the things. And so, yeah.
It reminds me. So when I was at my previous institution, one of the things that I was supposed to do was help improve scholarship of teaching and learning, right? Including publications and educational research. And one of the things that I did to try to help encourage people was I created an award for scholarship of teaching and learning, right? So, and it was, the bar was fairly low. It was like, if you've had one publication or if you've written a paper, that kind of thing. And it was really interesting because I got some feedback from faculty before we, published it. And one of the faculty members was like, well, I'm really doing all these really cool things in my class, but I'm not publishing about them. Can we change this to be like scholarship of teaching and learning, but maybe just implementation? And I'm like, no, because what I want you to do is, if you're doing really cool things in class, I want you to tell other people about it. And I want other people to have the opportunity to learn from that. So I appreciate that you're doing this, but you need to take the next step, right? And publish it. And this is a great way to do that. Is they don't have to do, like Eric pointed out, I don't have to do this gigantic study.
This is manageable stuff.
It doesn't take money. You don't even need a graduate assistant. You just need to get a little bit of help and put together something coherent that's potentially useful and thoughtful. And
if you don't know where to start, there are people out there who want to help you. And that's one cool thing. That's one thing I think that's great. And I hope to see that happen with AVE, is getting people together, because that was really helpful for me early on in this portion of my career, is working with other people, because it was really daunting the first time. You're like, this is different writing than I'm used to. But you can find mentors and you can find people to help you with that. And but I think you're absolutely right. That'd be like saying, well, I've done all this research, but like I just haven't published it. And so, but like, isn't it fine? I'm at least helping my patients. My diabetics are doing way better than the average, but like, let's just share that with anyone.
Why wouldn't you want to share that though?
No, only diabetics will survive.
Yeah.
Whenever, I feel like people are giving pushback about paper types that are not, randomized blinded controlled clinical trials, like experimental study design, I like to throw at them the little tidbit that Watson and Crick's description of deoxyribose nucleic acid was a letter to the editor. So don't even come at me with this. It's got to be an experimental study.
That's a little bit of trivia I didn't know. I love that.
I didn't know that either. And I will say, just as a plug, our textbook is now out. All three of us who contributed to this textbook has now been published.
Major congratulations.
Thank you. And one of the chapters is actually on educational research, written by Jill Mackey. And she talks about this idea that the randomized control trial is the quote unquote gold standard, but she questions whether that actually should be the quote unquote standard. And I think does a fabulous job in that chapter about saying, listen, there's no such thing as a perfect research design. So if you think that a randomized control study is great, that's great. It is, but I don't think we should call it the gold standard, because here's the holes in that process. And then talks about why it's so important to understand that when you're going into educational research, because you really shouldn't be doing randomized control studies in educational research because of all of the ethical issues, right? With not providing the same advantages to some students that you might provide to other students. So I think she actually does a really great job of that. And it is important to sort of think about ways that we can shift that, even that traditional biomedical sciences approach to research, and thinking that, well, I mean, randomized controlled studies are great, but that doesn't mean that they're great for everything, and nor should they be the gold standard for everything, right?
Well, it depends on the question you're asking, because even in biomedical sciences and healthcare, like research, you can't start with a double-blinded placebo-controlled rate. You have to do all the foundational research first. You have to get a lot of things sorted out before you even get to that point. So I think gold standard is an unfair descriptor for that. It depends on what your question is. If you are trying to determine, what is the best treatment, or what is the impact of this particular medication on this disease in 10,000 people, that's probably where you're going to want to go.
Right.
But, that's not what we're doing here. Right. It's apples and oranges. And there are some questions that would come up in education research where that might be the design that is most appropriate for your research question, but it's not going to be the case. Just like in, biomedical research, you need to design your study to fit what the question you're trying to ask, and what knowledge do you already have? What are you building on? And so, I think it's a misunderstanding to say that is the gold standard. It's really hard and it's really expensive, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's always the best thing, right? Or
that it's better. Just because something's more expensive doesn't necessarily mean it's better.
Sometimes it does, but sometimes it just means it's more expensive.
Yeah. With macaroni and
So,
cheese, it makes a difference, but you know, not.
Ooh, I don't know. I love me a good box of Kraft mac and cheese, not gonna
Oh
lie.
no, that Velveeta's and cheese is a little bit better. And
Ooh,
God.
see, this is
So
where I
Bobby,
actually agree
you
with you.
wanted to talk about
I do.
motivation.
Yeah, I
Um,
do.
and I'm glad that you did, because one of the sections where she doesn't spend a lot of time, but she talks about intrinsic motivation, extrinsic
Mhm.
motivation. These are also principles from self-determination theory, which is one of my favorite pet
Yeah,
theories. Like I live my
yeah,
life basically by
yeah.
self-determination theory.
Yeah. It's one of the motivation theories that I think resonates really a lot with me as well. Okay, but here's my plug. If you are not, an educational psychologist, or you don't have extensive, background in the theories of human motivation, I have a resource for you. And one of the faculty at the educational psychology program at Virginia Tech, and the person who's my mentor for my master's, is Brett Jones, and he's done a lot of research in the field of motivation. But here's the fun part: he developed a model called the music model of motivation, and what it does is it takes, I don't want to say all, but like all of the major theories in motivation, like self-determination theory, and melds them together and takes the bits and pieces from all of them. And basically, his approach is motivation is complex, right? It's not one thing, or it's not these two things. And so all of these different theories have picked out this. Here's this piece of motivation that all collectively, puts is kind of paints the bigger picture. And he has kind of pared that down into the acronym MUSIC, which stands for empowerment. So the M in empowerment, usefulness, success, interest, and caring. So that is, if you piece together all the things, like you can find bits and pieces of all of those things. So he pares it down. So you can go to themusicmodel.com, and he's got a lot of really good information. He refers back to all the major theories, but what he's created is like an inventory. So it's a way for you to, if you're an educator, you can take this survey, or you can give your students in a class this survey, or you can do this checklist to see what things am I doing in my course to help motivate students. Because yes, there's an intrinsic component, but there are some extrinsic things that we as educators can have an influence on. We can't influence everything, and there are certain things that even the individual can't influence, things that are out of our control that might impact our motivation. But what are things that we as instructors can do to try to help motivate our students? And so it's just a really useful resource that if I thought would be really lovely for people to be aware of, because I think he makes it very manageable and approachable for people who are not like steeped into motivation science. But I'm with you, Eric, because I think self-determination theory is like really fascinating. And again, it's for me probably one of the closest to like capturing a lot of the different pieces of motivation. But yeah, like that's where my brain went when I read this. Again, to be entirely fair to this paper, it wasn't meant to be a review article on motivation. So they just, touch on it a little itty bit. But I thought that would be something that if people weren't aware of, I find it to be a really, really helpful resource when thinking about motivation and how I can apply different techniques and tactics in like my classroom, in the clinic. So Catherine, I saw you nodding because we've kind of talked about it a little bit before, but is that something either of you had really heard of or are aware of the music model specifically?
I'm aware of the music model because you asked me to moderate a session
Yeah.
about it. I was not familiar with it prior to that, but
Okay.
I'm interested in it. I think I'm a little bit intimidated by motivation because I think it's, as you've pointed out, so complex, right? So important, so complex, and just really, really challenging to figure out how to motivate because it is such an individual thing. Um, and I loved that they touched on it and they talked about it a little bit and sort of defined what intrinsic versus extrinsic, and they talked about sort of the challenges of veterinary students who may come in as, sort of intrinsically motivated, but then become extrinsically motivated or vice versa. And I also like that they tied that to this idea of, and they didn't explicitly do this, but sort of paired that with this idea that oftentimes we as veterinarians and veterinary students come in with a little bit of imposter syndrome already. And then the experience of vet school sort of amplifies that imposter syndrome, and that can have an effect on motivation. And I think that is something that people don't often think about, that if you are doubting yourself, then in many ways you're going to sort of not be as motivated, right?
Demotivated. Yeah. If
It's
you don't feel you
demotivating
can
to
be
think,
successful,
right,
successful at something, you're like, why am I going to waste my time on this? And
exactly.
that's fair.
Exactly. And so I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about that aren't necessarily particularly related to this paper that they touch on that could really spiral us into a very complex conversation about motivation, imposter syndrome, the well-being, the sort of, you know, the anxiety, all of the things that are sort of happening right now and swirling around. But I did love that they talked about it. But I will admit to you that motivation is one of those things in general that I think is very intimidating to me, because it is so complex. It's fascinating, but it's a little scary.
Yeah.
I had heard of this enough to make a note in my what is this 8-page single space list of research ideas. Apply music model of motivation.
Yay!
That's it. That was my
You'd heard of it
to myself.
Only 8 pages, huh? Only.
I know. I think it's 9-point font. Speaking of approachable, I will plug in for self-determination theory. There is an RSA animate by Dan Pink called Drive, and he basically breaks it down with a bunch of examples and like applications in the real world. That was my first introduction. I watched this YouTube video and I was like, this is cool as heck.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
I think that's what I've really enjoyed learning about, like motivation theory. And the one thing that what I really appreciate about the music model in particular is it's a very complex thing. I think the analogy Brett uses is you have like a bunch of blind people and they're walking up and they're feeling an elephant, and each of them is at a different point of the elephant, right? People have heard this analogy. And if all you're feeling is what's in front of you, you're like, oh, you know, it's this long ropey thing. Oh, it's this big, you know, you don't have the full picture. And so what he's trying to do with the music model is take the, you know, here's the bit. When you're doing your research on motivation, you're looking at this one thing, because that's how research works. Like you can really only look at one thing effectively at a time, typically. And so, yes, this is a factor in human motivation. And then over here, they found this is also a factor in human and this is also, and then they interplay with each other, which is why it gets really complicated and intimidating. And so this time, this didn't seem to have an effect, and this other time it did. And what's going? Because people are complicated. But I find that the music model is, again, it also makes sense, right? If I feel like I have some control, that's where the empowerment is, which gets to self-determination theory as well. If I feel like I have some control over the outcome of this, I'm going to be more motivated than if I don't have any say, any control. So how do we empower students to, you know, choose some portion of what they want out of this course, you know, choose which assignment you want to do, you know, that kind of thing. And then, you know, is this useful to me? Because sometimes we're like, this is just really fun and I like it. But for like our vet students, if we've all experienced this, right? Like, when am I ever going to use this? Yeah. They're demotivated. So how do we explain to them how this will be useful to you? And then suddenly, okay, I mean, I might not love it, but at least I understand why I need to do it. Like that's, you know, drug calculations is like my favorite go-to for this. Like the students that don't love doing the math are like, oh, but I do understand that is the thing I need to know. And so I can put some time into that. And then the success, like, is this something I can, like, if this is something you're good at, it's like, yeah, I want to do this all day. It makes me feel good about myself. I want to feel like I can get better at this. And then is it interesting? That's, you know, the I and the music model, like, this is just interesting to me. And that's where, like, as instructors, let me share with you this story of this case that I had and how cool this was. And those kinds of things are that's also motivating. And then the interesting one for me, which is probably one of the hardest to study, but does come up in a number of different motivation theories, is, does anybody else care? Yeah. Is there a community that I'm a part of? You know, does my instructor care? Do the other people in the class care how I do, and if that I can succeed? And that can have a really profound effect. A lot of that research has been done on young children, but there is some on adults as well, and that matters, right? We've all heard or seen that quote that no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care. Yeah. And that kind of stems from that, like, you know, we sort of like, I want people to care too. And that, you know, if somebody's going to be disappointed if I don't do well, or somebody's going to be proud of me, that can be motivating as well. So that's kind of how the music model works really nicely for me, is like this mental checklist now. I mean, what are the things that I'm doing that can address each of those? And then here are the theories that support the reasons why, which is also very, very cool. But if you are interested in doing some music model research, let me know. I can also put you in touch with Brett, because we're like BFFs. No, not at all. But he's a super lovely guy, and he loves collaborating with people. So yeah, if you want to take that somewhere, let me know.
Well, and something that you said, to bring it back to the study, is the kind of relevance question. And I did want to bring this up. Some of the example questions that they gave, I thought were really well crafted, in that they were good for regardless of what you're going to do in veterinary medicine.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that that requires some discussion and acknowledgement, because so many questions that I see written and that people ask in exams and whatnot are just really specific.
Yeah.
And the equine vets are like, when the heck am I going to ever use this? You know? And the vice versa with the small animal vets, you know. But like, one of the questions, if your city council in your town asks you to draft guidelines for minimal housing requirements for backyard chickens, I mean, yeah, like, you got DVM after your name. They're just going to call you up, you know?
Found your name on the website.
Yeah. I really like that concept.
I'm glad you brought that up, Eric. That's a great point.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that, I have a note in the margin here that says, I like these options, because the options for the students to answer the questions were, the rating scale was a rating scale of 1 to 4. And 1 was, I would have no idea how to respond. 2 was, I would have had an answer, but not be confident it was totally correct. 3, I could create a good answer if I had a couple of minutes to look things up. 4, I am very confident I could give a complete answer without consulting resources. And once again, I thought it was very thoughtful and really, in many ways, safe for the students to say that, right? Like, we're putting it out there that this is an option for you, and it's okay for you to say, I don't think I could do anything with this. And circle that with, you know, not feeling like you're going to have any kind of punitive measures, or people looking at you like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you don't know how to create a guideline for minimum housing requirements for backyard chickens, you know. And so
it's not walking around knowledge.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I agree with you, Eric. On the whole, I felt like the questions were really nice, and I felt like the answer choices were also really well thought through. And I don't know if they created those on their own, if they got those from something else, but I thought they were really, really well done.
I like the breadth that they covered too. So you can imagine that, you know, all students could find something that, like, okay, well, God, it's how likely is it that I'm going to be in a situation with somebody? But most of these were like, no, this is like a random person asking. A pet store calls and asks you for guidance. Like, are you just going to be like, well, I don't know anything? Well, you're representing the whole profession right now. So we would love it if you could at least say, well, I could come up with a reasonable answer, or I'd love to have a few minutes to like verify some of these things. That's super reasonable. And so, yeah, I think you're right. The choices that they had were also realistic. You're like, if I had a few minutes to verify a couple things, like backyard chickens, okay, I probably need to check a couple things before I would want to, like, you know, say, yes, I stand behind this. But yeah, I could come up with that. And I know where those resources, but there's so much that's packed into those answer choices that is also reflective of real life. So yeah, I thought there was a really nice distribution of questions. And I don't know about you all, but when I was reading it, I was like thinking for myself, how would I rate on each of these? I was like, I might need to go back and take some of these courses, but I might afford it in a few minutes.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, on the flip side of that, this is sort of my researcher hat coming in, is like, I'm very curious if there's any kind of correlation between the pre and post self-assessments and exam scores in those courses, right? Yeah. And they talk about that a little bit, like, we didn't compare these to exam scores, blah, 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 blah. But from the like researcher perspective, I wonder if now these students have too much confidence, because they say, you know, most of them went from like sort of the 1 area to the 3 or 4 area, or are these students' self-assessments actually realistic based on their performance within the course? Like, if they got a 62% in the course, but they're still answering, oh yeah, I could totally answer those questions without having to do any references. how is that then going to affect their motivation later? So those kinds, when I talked at the very beginning about sort of the follow-up questions that I would have from this sort of paper, to me, those are things that I would be really interested in exploring and looking at correlations and seeing if there's anything there, because I would imagine that there's probably a good subset of students where those are pretty well aligned, but I would also imagine that there's a subset of students, I don't know how small or large, that they're not aligned. And I would be curious to explore why that might have
a really good point. The other
So
thing
we did that, just as an aside. So we did that with surgery students. So we did student self-assessment and proctor evaluation to see how well students were scoring themselves. And the basic conclusion is not great.
That Kruger-Dunning effect, right? Or Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah, exactly.
Whichever comes first.
What was interesting is that scores got closer over time.
Okay.
So I don't know if that was like the proctors now resetting their expectations, and then the students also like getting feedback and improving.
Well, the other thing, and this ties right lovely into self-efficacy theory, right? Where so that was where I was going to go is, well, what were the actual assessments for the course? Were they asked questions that were similar to these? Because your accuracy in predicting how good you were going to be at something increases if you've actually had to try to do the thing.
Correct.
And so if the questions on the exam mirrored what these questions were, and they took an exam and then they found out how they did, then they probably are going to have a better rating. And so I wonder if that's happening with, surgery and proctors and giving them feedback, that the scores are getting better, partly because the students are like, yeah, I think I could do that. And then they try to use, oh, it turns out I can't do that very well. There's that reality check, or, oh, wow, I did better than I thought I would. So maybe next time I'll rate myself more accurately. And the analogy, that my professor used was like, okay, you're standing at a basketball court and you're standing 3 feet, 7 feet, 10 feet in that half court line. How confident are you that you can make a basket? And then you get to go and shoot a basket and then rate how confident are you that you can make a basket, and it's interesting how, if it's something you've done a lot, like maybe you've shot a lot of baskets in basketball, and so you're like, probably pretty good at this, and you can rate that. But if you're like, I didn't grow up in a country with basketball, so I have no idea, I'd have to try it to be able to give you some sort of accurate assessment of how I think I could do that, or watch somebody else do it. But that's going to be harder, right? To think, you're either going to over or underestimate your ability. So I would be curious to know like what they were tested on, and would that have an impact on that too? So yeah, there's another layer to the study. We can go ahead and hack on to Eric's list.
I underlined this statement in the introduction for a couple of reasons. And it was in the second paragraph, they said, studies on populations of education students have demonstrated that self-assessments can be used to help students consider their learning and thinking processes and monitor their progress, and to motivate them in their learning. And the reason that I underlined that, well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, I thought it was interesting that they took a study from education students, and this is going to sound horrible, but is actually factual. Education students who go on, so like education students who are teachers or who go on to get master's degrees in education, traditionally score the lowest of any cohort of students pursuing graduate study on the GRE consistently across the board. And it is not a small amount of lowest. It's probably 50 points lower than the next group, which I think is really interesting and also really sad, right? Because to me, it demonstrates that there is a continued sort of social reinforcement that people who are educators don't have to be as smart as people who do other things. And that is really saddening to me, because I feel like our best people should be educators. Not to discount the people who are educators. Please don't misunderstand me.
Or to think that like the GRE is the best metric.
Exactly. Okay. But it is one measure, and they consistently score lower. And then the other thing that I found really interesting in this, and they didn't say self-reflection, but they talk about used to help students consider their learning. And to me, that's sort of a phrase akin to self-reflection.
Yeah.
And one of the things about self-reflection that's so interesting is that if you read the literature on self-reflection, and trust me, I have read a lot of literature on self-reflection, everybody says it's great. It's such a wonderful tool for learning, and it really helps people, motivate them and helps them understand more about what they do and don't know. But if you actually dig into it, people never teach people how to reflect. people never say self-reflection looks like this, or this is what self-reflection should do for you, or this is maybe even the way you should start doing self-reflection. And there's a parallel there to education, right? So it's this idea of very rarely, and fortunately, we're in a time now where that's increasing, but people who don't go specifically into education are not taught how to be educators, right? And that's a reflection, or that's a sort of a parallel to this idea that we expect people to be able to self-reflect, but we don't teach them what that is because we just somehow think intrinsically they should know.
Know
And
the word self, and I know the word reflect. Okay,
right.
yeah, I got it.
But studies have shown time and time again that actually people don't know how to self-reflect. They don't know what that means, and they don't know what they're supposed to get out of it. And people who are telling people to self-reflect often don't know what it is they're telling people to do. And so it's one of those little nuggets that I probably read way too much into, but it was just a very interesting statement to me. And I thought, I'm going to talk about this. So there you go. There's my nerding out for the evening.
Yeah, I think that that's important though, because I think about that. I have, reflection assignments, and as part of the description, I have a several page primer on like how to do reflection, and like these are some questions to ask, and this is the point of this exercise, and then this is your state of mind, and be caring to yourself, like all these things that you like you said, like I think as educators we just assume people know that now you kind of need to be explicit.
Well, and the other thing that I've seen too is that there are some who are naturally good at self-reflecting, and there are some who are not good at it. And of that subset of people who are not good at it, there's a further subset of people who just hate it. They just don't like doing it. And there are some who they just don't know how, but once you teach them how, then maybe they're never going to love it, but they appreciate it, right? But that subset of students who hate it or are just not interested in doing it, it's a really interesting subset of people, right? Because everything that we're told, at least as in my circles, is that if you're not a self-reflective person, then you're not going to grow as much, and you're not going to learn as much, and you're not going to be, all of these things. But that's not necessarily true. Like there's a subset of students who don't like to self-reflect and won't self-reflect. They're still successful.
And they'll excel,
yeah.
Well,
So,
they probably have developed a different technique.
Reminds me of a friend of mine who has panic attacks during meditation.
Yep.
It's like,
right,
it's supposed to be,
that is the opposite
like,
of what you're supposed to be getting out of this. Yeah.
Exactly.
Can't handle it. Yeah.
Yeah. So meditation can be really great for some people, but clearly for that person, it's not working. So you find a different thing. And that's again, somebody who doesn't like self-reflection is probably not in every case, maybe, but in a lot of cases, they've probably figured out a different path to get similar results, or to find a way to grow. So yeah, if you're not a self-reflector, well, this isn't going to be your mechanism, but that doesn't mean there's no other way. And then again, I think that's where all of this stuff can be intimidating, because it's not that clear cut. It's not that black and white. And the studies often make it seem like, okay, we're going to look at this one piece. And you're like, but that's just one little tiny piece of an elephant. Yeah. And so, remembering that can sometimes it can be daunting, right? Because these kinds of things are complicated. And we're not even getting into all of the pieces of motivation that we have zero control over, right? You just found out you had an emergency in your family. Guess what? Your motivation for class has just been affected like hugely, and that's not anyone's fault. That's life. That things happen, and we have to kind of roll with that. But there's certain things that we just don't have control. The pieces that we can, and we can have a little influence on, and I think that's always really fascinating.
I want to really quickly, I want to go back to your comment that those people who are not good at self-reflecting may have found other ways to grow, and I agree with that. But I do think there's also a very small subset of people who don't grow, who don't find other ways to grow.
Yeah.
And they are still successful.
That's true.
By some measure of success or standard. And so I would be really curious to study those people, right? Because I've always felt like if I'm not learning, I'm not alive, I'm not growing. Like I tell people when I stop learning, I'm probably dead. But there are, I think, a very small group of people out there, maybe it's bigger than I think, that sort of hit a wall with learning or stop learning, don't learn, and they don't want to reflect, they don't want to grow. They're just fine being where they are and still are able to function and do the things that they need to do to be successful by whatever measure of success they've
I
decided
have a
to.
hard time wrapping my brain around that, because you had to grow at some point to get to that plateau, right? Like you had to climb at some point. Like there had to be some growth. Like you've learned to talk, you've learned to walk, like there,
Well, and
there was
maybe,
some minimal. And then, yeah, like you said, you hit a wall.
yeah.
What is
And
that?
maybe it's not no growth, but maybe it's
Right.
just such infinitesimal growth that
Yeah.
it's just like watching,
Yeah.
hair grow,
Or
and
it's no
eventually
growth in this particular
right.
area, right? Like this is something that I'm like, yeah, I'm content with where I'm at and I don't need to get any better. But I also feel like entropy kind of sits in. And if you're not, like, I don't know that you can really plateau. Like I feel like that takes work to maintain. And if you're like making no effort to grow, then you're probably falling backwards. But I don't know. I'm just making that up. I don't know of any research that supports what I just said. But yeah, like I
It
just
makes
really
me
have a hard
think.
time wrapping my brain around that.
It makes me think of at Georgia, we had a psychologist come and talk to us about, student success or something. And he just had this like throwaway line that we didn't explore, but it stuck with me. He was talking about like people who have sociopathic personality disorder, which is now they call it a different thing. But he was like, but like that could be successful. And then he moved on. And it's like, yeah, like sociopaths think they're doing fine in life.
Exactly. And many of them actually are.
I was going to say, by a lot of metrics, like people often mix up sociopath and psychopath, but a lot of sociopaths like are CEOs of companies.
Or leaders,
Yes,
right?
They're
Yeah,
very
exactly.
successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and if you've ever taken
So,
the sociopath inventory test, like there's some features that you're like, oh yeah, oh my gosh, where it's like 20 different things, like a couple of them like resonate. And so like, I don't think I qualify as a sociopath, but some of those things I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah. That piece I get, or
But
I have.
listen, we all work with sociopaths. It's like one out of every 5 people, something
sure.
in the United States is like technically qualifies to be classified as a sociopath. And we think of it as negative, but there are really
There's some
positive
protective qualities in, for sure. And like everything, right? It's not a black or white. There's a scale and there's a spectrum. And but no, I think it's a really interesting. Yeah, I'm surprised you let that go at the time. Wait a minute, stop what you're doing. I want to dig into this. But yeah, no, there's plenty of examples of by a lot of metrics, very successful sociopaths. But that's the other thing too. How are you defining success and in what ways? If you're talking about your relationships with other people, maybe that's a different scale,
Right.
If you're one of those sociopaths that has a hard time with empathy, that could have an impact on your social relationships, but might make you a really, really good leader in a certain circumstance.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, people are complicated.
Yes.
So another thought that I had with the article is I wanted to do something very similar to this with our anesthesia rotation, basically give them an exam about anesthesia topics at the front end so that they could, one, reflect on what they know already, and more importantly, identify what they don't know.
Yeah.
And then give them an exam at the end of the rotation that hopefully they would do tremendously better on, and that they could then make that comparison and be like, oh my gosh, I learned so much and I had a good experience, hopefully as a consequence. Never executed it, but that's kind of what this reminded me of, and showing the students that they learned.
Yeah.
Because I think that we don't do that very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this actually sparks in me. So you're getting ready to get a couple of emails from me tomorrow morning. But we have at Virginia, Maryland, we have what's called an animal instructor program. And so it's essentially client-owned animals that come in, and our first-year students get an opportunity to learn how to do a physical exam and to do some of the basic skills in animal handling and those kinds of things. And as sort of a reward, if those clients come in on multiple occasions, they get like a year of heartworm and flea and tick, prevention for free, and they get vaccines for free and those kinds of things. And so there's this really mutually beneficial relationship that happens. Sort of parallel to that, for a couple of years, we had managed a dog colony from shelters that stayed on campus that our first-year students worked with to help out with behavior. They walked them, they took care of them, those kinds of things. Again, getting some animal handling experience. For several reasons, we are now getting rid of that dog colony. And we are expanding the animal instructor program to the point where now our animal instructors will not only provide the opportunity for first year students to get that hands-on experience, but we are now providing the opportunity for some of those animals to go into a surgery lab for the third year students who have previously not really had the opportunity to do a dog castration unless they had been through their shelter clerkship in between their second and third years. But in the process of the third years doing that dog castration, the second years are going to be running the anesthesia, and the first years are going to be helping out with the physical exam, getting weights, pulling blood, and doing some of that animal handling. And then the three of them are all going to be working together in the same lab. And the reason that comes to mind is that very reason that you talk about, Eric, is for me, this is an extraordinary opportunity for the first years to come in, get some skills, and look at the second years and say, that's going to be me next year. And how exciting is that? For the second years to know and be able to demonstrate to their first year cohort, this is what I've learned, and this is really cool. I actually do know more than you, right? Not because it's a competition, but because sometimes you do feel like you haven't learned anything.
Yeah.
And for the third years to do the same thing with the second years. And so I'm really excited about this because to me, I mean, I've worked with a lot of vet schools. I've seen a lot of vet school curricula, and I haven't seen a school that really integrates all 3 years in such a way that it provides an opportunity for all 3 of those years to really have that interaction, and for those third years to say, gosh, I really do know more than the second years, and I really do know more than the first years, and I do have the confidence to be able to come in and mentor them and help them. And maybe if they have an anesthesia issue, I can answer that instead of them having to call over the instructor. And the same with the second years with the first year. So I think it's going to be really great, and maybe we should do a research project on it, because to me, maybe it's going to help self-efficacy. Maybe it's going to help motivation. Maybe it's going to help them feel better about the fact that I worked really hard and maybe I didn't do as well as I like, but man, I've really learned something, and how important that's going to be.
I've told this story, I don't know how many times, maybe even on this podcast, but once when I was a fourth year in school, I was on my equine medicine rotation. So not like my area of like, this is not what I'm going to do. But I had a case, and there was like some club that would do like lunchtime rounds, and, people who were interested in just whatever, learning new things. So first, second, whatever, third years would come at lunchtime, and they would, come down to the large animal hospital, and they would just round on the cases that were in the hospital. And so I happened to be in the stall with the horse that was my case at the time when this group of students comes by, and, there's probably like a dozen students there. And I assume there was like an instructor or somebody, I don't even know, but they were like, hey, can you tell us about this? Is this your case? Can you tell us about this case? And I was sure. So I start like just presenting the case that I've been doing for years now. And so, I start with a signalment and this, that. And then I said, it's got like azotemia, and the little hand in the back goes up and it's like, what does azotemia mean? And I was like, oh yeah, yeah. I didn't know what that meant either when I was the first year, or like some of just the terms that we used. And so I'm like, wow. And so I'm just talking about this case like it's nothing. Like I'm just presenting it, blah, 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 not even thinking about it. And all of a sudden, a brave student was like, can you just stop for a second and explain what the heck you're saying? And I was like, man, I'm not feeling the most confident on this particular rotation. This is not my like comfort zone, but that was really eye-opening for me to stop and think, I've learned a whole new language, and I need to give myself some credit for that. So that was like a huge, like if you ever, I tell students all the time, if you need a confidence boost, talk to some first years.
Yeah, exactly.
And the thing is, you start to realize really quickly that that's where you were just a couple years ago, and how big of a gap there is. And so, yes, I love the peer-to-peer teaching across years, because I think it's amazing. And like you said, it's also like, that's going to be me. Like that's also really exciting for the underclass. And yeah, it's just so, so powerful.
And I think it makes it more tangible at that point, right? Like if you're a first year student and you see the fourth years graduating, it feels so far away. But if you're a first year student working with a second year student, gosh, next year, that's going to be me. That's a lot closer and a lot more tangible. And so, yeah, I think it'll be great. And I had a similar situation when I was a second year student. I wasn't even a second year student. We were first years. We had just finished our first year. And I remember, I don't know how you all felt. That school was really hard for me. And I got done with my first year and I was like, I don't know anything, right? Like I don't feel like I've learned anything. and I mean, I had passed all my classes, but I didn't feel like I learned anything. And so I was helping out with orientation for the first year students, and the first year students were coming into orientation. We're having conversations. They're asking me questions. I'm answering questions. And I got to a point where I was saying something. I don't know if I was talking about the antebrachial carpal joint or what I was doing, but the students looking at me like, what did you just say? You know,
Yeah.
and it was the same sort of light bulb moment of like, oh, I did learn something,
I am
like I did
smart.
learn something, and that first year was worthwhile. So
Yeah.
absolutely, I think it makes
I
sense.
used to send the senior students down to surgery lab.
Yeah.
And it was just like you said, Catherine, like the seniors would answer anesthesia questions or whatever
Yeah.
that the students would ask without the instructors necessarily getting involved. And the juniors were more comfortable
Yeah.
asking questions,
Yeah.
of the seniors. And this also reminds me of one of my dreams is to have students have a required academic rotation during their fourth
Yeah.
year when they would insert themselves into the rest of the curriculum. Like
Oh.
go teach some first through third year some stuff.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
cool.
that'd be great.
Eric, I want to come back to the study that you wanted to do in your clerkship, because again, bringing this back to the motivation stuff.
Oh yeah.
I love, so there's a few things that is really cool about that. And a clerkship, I think, presents a unique opportunity to take advantage of it. And that is, the usefulness and the empowerment. Like, so if you say, okay, you're going to take this quiz or this test before the anesthesia rotation and try to identify the areas that you need to work on. Now you get to try to cater, like we're going to work with you and say, oh, you need to work on this. We're going to try to make this the rotation exactly what you need to improve in these areas. And so that can be really helpful, because now they're saying, this is really useful for me. I get to focus on the things that I need. And I feel like I have some, again, part of self-determination theory, like I have some say over what's happening. And so like from a motivation standpoint, that's also really, really powerful stuff. So I think, and again, that's easier to do in a clerkship, I think, with a handful of students than it is in a classroom, to say, okay, we're going to teach this today because Joey needed it. And then, but in a clerkship, I think you can do that and say, oh, we really want to make sure we get this student an opportunity to, anesthetize a respiratory case or whatever. Like there are things that you can do a little more easily in a clerkship. So I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, I do. All my rounds topics are also student selected. I'm like, here's the file, go and add whatever topics you want to talk about. And whatever they add is what we talk about.
Yep.
Yeah,
I like to give them some ideas, but yeah, same thing.
Yeah. And I want to point out, and this is andragogy as a theory is very controversial. I recognize that. And there is more and more support for the idea that there's not a dichotomy between andragogy and pedagogy, right? So for those of you who might be listening that don't understand, andragogy is sort of this theory that adult learning is different than pedagogy, which is teaching children. And even Malcolm Knowles, who was the sort of originator, or not, he wasn't the originator, but he was sort of the person that made it really popular in the United States, this idea of andragogy, did later in his career recognize that and acknowledge that really teaching is sort of this spectrum, right? And there are things that you might use for adults that would also be useful for children and vice versa. But some of the sort of basic tenets of andragogy include that it needs to be applicable. It needs to be an opportunity so like adult learners like the opportunity to have some say in what they do and what they learn. And this is also aligns with self-determination theory and self-efficacy, right? So they have some control over what's going on. They need to be able to relay it to previous information and understand how it's going to apply to them in their future careers. And so it's really interesting how all of these things tie together, because it's messy, but it's also really cool because there are sort of different pools of theory that you can draw from, but they all really do interconnect and really do support each other in so many different ways, because many of the things you're talking about with the music model, self-determination theory, all these things also are reflected in sort of Malcolm Knowles' idea of andragogy and what is really important for adult learners. So
yep. Yeah, it all pieces together. It's like medicine, right? Like, oh, I understand the kidneys really well, but I don't know what the heart does. That's not going to work, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard, right? Because the kidneys are complicated, and and how the heart works, it's sort of complicated at times. But the more you understand about the bits and pieces, and then you go, oh, this is how this one influences that one. And yes, I can study just what's happening in the heart. but there are things that are outside of the heart that are probably impacting this if I'm not careful. And I think, learning and motivation and all of this is the same. So you isolate this one piece and you do the best you can, but you have to remember, I'm only looking at this piece. And there's a lot of other things that are going on. And if we all work together, and I share, this is why you have to publish, I share what I found in mine and somebody else shared what they found in theirs, and then we can all put together a bigger picture. So we can circle back to the, get your stuff out there, share it with others. This is how we all learn more. Don't keep it to yourselves.
And practice, right? I'm sitting here thinking about, my brain functions very strangely sometimes, but so we're talking about the music model of motivation, which is interesting to me because I was actually a musician for a very long time. Yeah. And I'm sitting here thinking about this idea that the more you practice, you can, so I've put down my instrument for a long time, but when I go back to those pieces that I've looked at for a long time, they're so much easier for me now because I did practice them and I was familiar enough with them before and I knew where the stumbling blocks were and I'd work through them. And now I go back to them and I can pick them up much more easily. And this is the same way with medicine or surgery or any of the things that you do, right? So I have been helping a couple of students who are struggling a little bit study, and I make them no promises because I tell them, listen, I wasn't the best student, but I can at least stumble through this. I didn't kill anything I wasn't supposed to in practice. And so I ordered this like sort of more basic physiology book because physiology and I were not the best of friends. And I was reading through, because a lot of the questions they had were physiology. And so I was reading through this to do some, studying. I was looking at hyperthyroidism in cats, for example. And the student came in, we were talking about, and I was like, I was reading this physiology book and like, I understood it way better than I remembered understanding it when I was in vet school. And so it's the same principle, right?
Well, you have just so much more knowledge too. And you have something, because like when you first learn physiology, you haven't seen, hundreds of cases, right? And so you have to learn the physiology before we're going to let you legally see these cases. But once you've seen all these cases, you go back. I had the same experience when I was studying for boards. I don't know.
Well, that makes me feel better.
Well, where I went back and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah. Like you had time to go back and sit through all these things and read them, which you didn't really have during the residency. And then you're like, oh gosh, this is making so much sense. If only I'd known this when I was treating that patient a couple of years ago, so it's a little annoying at times, but you also, you have to circle back. You have to spiral and go back and sort of, relearn things. And it's also, I think, as educators, something that we experience where you go back and do it again and do it again. And then you get a deeper understanding every cycle through. And you think of, oh gosh, there's that new thing, or I thought of a new way to think of that or explain it. And so yeah, your brain is a very complex thing and you're always, adding new information to it. And then you haven't touched this for a while and you come back, you're like, oh, it turns out I have more to add to this. This is wonderful.
And the lovely thing too, is sort of building on that concept that Eric was talking about, is like, I don't know that we always do a good job of reminding ourselves how much we've learned, right? And so physiology, again, was one of those things that I really struggled with. And then I went back and read it and I was like, why did I struggle with this so much? But I did, and now I don't struggle with it as much. And it's like, I've learned. That's awesome. So
what's our takeaway from the article and discussion? I would say I'll go first. I think it actually touches on what Catherine just said, which is maybe we need to show the students the learning that they had.
Yeah.
We assume they get it, but we might need to show them. That's my takeaway.
I like it.
Yep.
Catherine?
I mean, I agree with that, but I think also we need to, when it comes to education and that kind of thing, we need to show ourselves what we've learned, right? We need to remind ourselves that we're continually learning and probably demonstrate that to students as well and make that a little bit more transparent for them, because education is not an easy thing to do. And it's definitely not an easy thing to do well. So.
Yeah, I love that. Those are both really good. I'm going to put out there, our takeaway is that you can put out like a very comparatively simple teaching tip for something that awesome that you're already doing. And you can stimulate so many ideas and so much discussion and inspire so many other people in a lot of ways, just like we've demonstrated here on this podcast. So thank you, Margaret, for your publication. I think it's great. Well done. Keep doing all the good work that you're doing. And yeah, thanks to you both for coming and talking about this. It was fun. It was thanks for letting me get my plug-in for motivation. And it's not me. I think it's a really cool thing that Dr. Jones has done. So, but yeah, it's been another great discussion. So thanks for having it with me.
Yay, thanks.
Hey, all right. Catch you later.